Jaws. The definitive shark summer horror film that has been terrifying audiences for 50 years now. While Jaws is famous for making everyone afraid of the ocean, the behind the scenes is almost as famous as the film itself. The making of this film was the perfect storm to create the movie we all know and love today. And this was because the people who worked on it could not have been more perfect to create the film and make it what it is. I love the film Jaws. I love sharks and I love movies, and this is easily the best shark movie there is. And I honestly don't think that will ever be replicated because it was made at a time where you couldn't use CGI. Steven Spielberg was young enough to make the decision to film it in the ocean, and Universal, for reasons I will discuss later, didn't shut down the production, even though it took 150 days instead of just the proposed 55. This is going to be my first video in a series about Jaws. In this video, I'll be talking about the making of Jaws and how even though the production itself was notoriously troubled, they still managed to make a fantastic film. This story starts in 1973, a year before the novel was even published. Publishers then, and now, I would imagine, often will send books while they're still being written to different studios and production companies to see if they want to buy the movie rights. Producers Rich Zanuck and David Brown are known for moving quickly on a project when they become interested in something. David Brown specifically would keep an eye on publishing and simply had to have the book Jaws when he learned what it was about. Zanuck and Brown paid $150,000 for the rights to adapt the novel into a movie, with $25,000 going to author Peter Benchley to write the first screenplay. At the time they were making this deal, Zanuck and Brown were also producing a little film called The Sugarland Express, helmed by a new director in his mid-20s, Steven Spielberg. The making of The Sugarland Express became one of the most important stepping stones to making Jaws. Many important members of the crew moved over to Jaws and contributed their energy and talents to create the film. Of course, there was Zanuck and Brown, who were the producers. With this exciting new shark movie, they considered a few different directors initially, such as Michael Winner and Ron Sturges, but in the end, Zanuck and Brown thought they would give the young Steven Spielberg a shot at this film. They had already seen him work on Sugarland, which was critically well received, even if it wasn't a massive success commercially. Editor Verna Fields moved over from Sugarland Express as well. Typically, most editors will do the brunt of the work after the film is shot. She, however, liked to be on set and put scenes together from the dailies to show Spielberg. I believe that is largely why the film is paced as well as it is. If she found something missing, she could just tell Spielberg and the crew about it and they could shoot it. Another important person that moved over from Sugarland Express was John Williams. That film was John Williams and Steven Spielberg's first collaboration together, the first of many, as we all know. And honestly, Jaws is certainly one of their most iconic collaborations. Those 4 notes are now synonymous with sharks. One can just hum those first 2 notes. Everyone immediately knows exactly what you're referencing. Even when I was little, and I had never seen the film, someone would hum those notes and I knew exactly what they were trying to tell me, trying to scare me into thinking that there was a shark or something. And those are iconic now. When Williams played those first few notes on the piano, Spielberg reportedly thought it was a joke. But thankfully, he eventually saw the brilliance in the simplicity of the notes and decided to go with it. I love how the music is used throughout the film to really evoke the shark just cruising through the water, even if you can't see it. Like sometimes the camera becomes the shark, and I love that. I believe these important collaborations were huge in making Jaws the film it is. In Zanuck and Brown, in trusting a young Spielberg, and Fields, who edited this film to perfection, Williams, who created one of the most iconic scores of all time, and it wasn't just me, and I guess audiences who felt this way. Both Fields and Williams won Academy Awards for their work in Jaws. Another crew member pulled from Sugarland Express was production designer Joe Alves. When Alves started looking for potential filming locations, he did his best to keep the locations in the United States. While he was touring the East Coast for his location scouting, he had been told that Martha's Vineyard wouldn't be a good fit, so he skipped it. Peter Benchley, the author, invited Alves over to dinner to meet his parents on Nantucket Island. On the way to Nantucket, the ferry was turned back because the weather was bad, so rather than just sitting around, he checked out Martha's Vineyard. And while he's searching for locations, he's not just looking for what the location is like on land. He also has to see if the water around that place has good conditions for filming. He was also, at this time, in the process of building the shark, and he knew what he thought would be the best filming conditions. The shark is on a steel platform that submerges into the water. It also has to be mechanically operated, and they didn't want to lose this expensive piece of equipment at the bottom of the ocean. So the shark had to operate in 25 to 35 feet of water with a level sandy bottom. And what does Martha's Vineyard have? 26-foot water with a sandy bottom. It was perfect. Not only that, it had that cute small town feel that would really make it seem like those tourist dollars every summer would make or break the town. It had beautiful beaches, nice tides, it had everything. Not only was it the perfect backdrop for the film, but also many of the unforgettable cast were from Martha's Vineyard. This was, in part, due to the Boston branch of the Screen Actors Guild, or SAG, negotiating with the studio that at least 10 of the speaking roles had to be filled by local actors. Shari Rhodes, the location casting director who also worked on the Sugarland Express, also believed that no one plays a part better than a real one. They add flavor and a groundedness to the film that wouldn't be there otherwise. Some notable parts played by locals are Lee Fierro plays Mrs. Kittner, mother to Alex Kittner, played by local Jeffrey Voorhees. He's the boy that gets eaten by the shark. Apparently, people have been asking Fierro to slap them ever since then because of her infamous scene of her slapping Chief Brody, which is pretty funny. Jonathan Filley plays Tom Cassidy, the young man who gets interviewed by Chief Brody after the first attack on Chrissy. Chris Urbello plays Michael Brody, Chief Brody's oldest son. Herschel West plays Quint's mate. I don't think he says anything in the film, but it definitely just feels right for that part to me because that's the kind of thing he was doing anyway. And his dog is also in the film. Henry Carriero plays one of the men who catches the first shark. Dick Young was the other fellow, and they improvised a lot of their scene, and they met for the first time on set. Craig Kingsbury plays Ben Garner in the film, but was also hugely influential in how Robert Shaw played Clint. He based his accent on and borrowed some of the phrases that he used. He is also the fellow whose head is found in the boat in the middle of the film, causing probably the biggest scare in the movie, for me anyway. A fun fact about this, they refilmed this scare in California in Verna Field's swimming pool because they felt the timing wasn't quite right.
When I went to that preview and that audience just went 6 feet off their seats and let out this incredible scream, that was really satisfying.
And, most importantly, Pippet, who plays the dog that gets eaten by the shark, was also a local. One of the biggest influences, in my opinion, in how the film turned out was having Steven Spielberg be the director. And as we all know, after he made Jaws, he was basically given permission to make essentially whatever he wanted and has been doing that for a long time. But he was really young when he was making Jaws. He only had 2 feature films under his belt at the time, The Sugarland Express and Duel, which is essentially Jaws but on the road. And I highly recommend watching it if you're interested in his career. You can kind of see the Spielbergisms and him figuring out his style in the film. I think a large part of why Jaws looks the way it does is because Spielberg was so young. Even in the book On Location on Martha's Vineyard, the author calls him Steve, which is really funny to me because in my head he is the Steven Spielberg. And so he comes across as this like big, huge character that's been around forever, but at the time he was in his 20s. Because of his fresh-eyed approach to filmmaking, and really because he didn't know any better, he wanted to do things a bit differently than they had been done. I imagine an older director who had been in the business a while would say something like, well, we'll film all our ocean scenes on a tank and a backlot because that's just how it's done. Maybe he knew this, but it's possible Spielberg just didn't know that no movie had been filmed out in the open ocean before. Maybe he just assumed that if the script said something happened in the ocean, then you would film it in the ocean. He wanted things to be real. And he felt not just this way about filming locations, but also for casting. Spielberg really wanted more unknown actors for his principal cast. He was worried that finding actors that were too famous would distract from the film, and he didn't want that. I think everyone in this film was perfectly cast from the top of the line down to every background actor. A director is always juggling a lot when on set, but their primary responsibility is getting their actors to perform what is needed for each scene. Spielberg believed a lot in having his actors improvise scenes. I think my favorite of these was the scene where Brody's son is copying him I guess the young actor was just doing that, and Roy Scheider told Spielberg what was happening, and they shot it. And honestly, it's probably my favorite little moment from the film. And of course, Spielberg's inexperience lent itself to taking on probably more than he knew he was in for. And probably the biggest challenge that Spielberg ran into because of his inexperience was wanting to film on the ocean when no one had really done that before. In the documentary, The Shark Is Still Working, that came out in 2005, Spielberg said this was the hardest movie he's ever made. And at that point, he'd directed 20-ish films. There were times that it seemed like this movie would never pan out. Originally, the plan was to film for 55 days in Martha's Vineyard. 35 of the days were supposed to be on land and 20 at sea. They wanted to finish filming before the peak tourist season began in Martha's Vineyard. This would mean that all of the cruise hotels and lodging would get more expensive because it was peak season. The budget was originally $3.5 million. The film ended up taking 150 days of principal photography, and the budget ended up ballooning somewhere in the ballpark of $9 to $11 million. They also thought, and this speaks volumes to me, that they were going to be able to train a shark to do what they needed it to do. I guess they had seen that same kind of thing with like other animals, but in my head, I'm just like, I can't imagine planning for that. And sharks, as we know now, I guess, are kind of simple creatures and unfortunately are not trainable. I love sharks more than any other animal. But I can't imagine trying to train them. What this tells me, though, is that everyone involved really had no clue what they were getting into if they did not know that sharks couldn't be trained. Like, that seems so obvious to me, but they just didn't know. But how did they get here? How does one think they're going to make a film for $3 million and it end up costing $9 million? One reason was the inexperience and a lack of knowledge about the difficulties filming on the ocean. Years later, Steven said of himself at the time, "I was naive about the ocean, basically. I was pretty naive about Mother Nature, and the hubris of a filmmaker who thinks he can conquer the elements was foolhardy. But I was too young to know I was being foolhardy when I demanded that we shoot the film in the Atlantic Ocean and not in a North Hollywood tank." At the time, normally, a movie set in the ocean would be filmed in a tank in a backlot somewhere in the hills of Hollywood. You could have complete control of the water, which, while consistent, definitely looked different than filming on the ocean. What made this also more tricky was they were trying to get the shark to work in the ocean, which it didn't most of the time. They filmed the land scenes while the shark team worked on getting the shark ready, but eventually they ran out of land scenes to film. There were 3 mechanical sharks. Each one weighed about 2,000 pounds. They were made up of a steel skeleton with a neoprene foam over the skin. Also on the inside of the shark were mechanics to make the shark's face move, so it wasn't just the skeleton. And when they were building the shark, because of the time, they were only able to test some of the shark, and they did not test it in salt water before they sent the shark over to Martha's Vineyard. And not only was the shark complicated, but it was also on a platform that had to sink in order to give the illusion that the shark was swimming on its own. And so they didn't want to lose their shark, they didn't want to lose the platform, so they had to be really careful about this. One of the first times they took the shark out into the ocean, it started to sink sideways, since one side was filling with water faster. This caused it to tip over on its side and fall into the ocean. It turned out fine, but it was a serious panic for the people working on the shark. And the shark was not the only important component to consider when filming on the ocean. There was, of course, weather to consider. Production was constantly checking the weather to make sure there were no upcoming storms, winds, or destructive tides that they would have to work around the next day. And then, if the weather was good enough, they had to assemble the crew and get them all out onto the ocean. This would mean several small boats ferrying out the crew into the ocean as far enough as they needed to be in the middle of the ocean for the sight lines they were looking for. Then they would have to anchor the boat so nobody was floating away. And then it had to be determined if the shark was going to work or not. One time, the shark met up with the crew at the location, which is essentially a spot in the ocean marked by buoys, and he had a dimple in his chin. They lost that entire day because they had to fix the shark. And everything could be in place. The shark is working. The weather is fine. The camera and the lights are placed. The actors are ready to go. Everyone is in position, and then another boat floats by. This is, of course, a laborious and frustrating way to work. They did this for months. And it seems like by the end they had figured out more or less how to make at least one of the sharks work for a day. While the shark was working and everything was in place, they would lower the platform into the water, and the shark would be working on this mechanical arm so it could skim over the water. It ran on steel rails on the platform where it could move about 70 feet in a straight line. They would then position the orca to where the shark was, and then position the camera to where the orca was. This was all, of course, very tricky. They had to maneuver the orca to look natural in the shot, but also not hit the shark or the platform. And this was, of course, in the case when everything was working. There were so many things that could go wrong that they often did. To fill the time when things weren't working, Spielberg started adding insert shots, which the crew thought was meant to keep the crew busy, but he ended up using almost all of those inserts they shot while waiting for the shark to work. Spielberg reflected on how he would film the same thing in 2005 versus how he did it in 1975.
If Jaws never existed, except in the year 2005, I would have had the digital tools to have much more of the shark in the movie. Therefore, I would have ruined much more of the movie.
Even the director himself said he would have directed it completely differently if he had made the same film 30 years later. And we can sort of picture what that would look like with films like Deep Blue Sea, where you see the sharks quite a bit. VFX really lends a lot of flexibility to a director in post-production, but that tool would have definitely made the shark a bigger presence, which in turn would have made the shark less menacing since we saw it more. But in any case, the shoot kept getting dragged out longer and longer. It seemed like there was no end in sight. Every time I hear about how long this shoot was, I wonder how in the world did Universal keep letting them make this movie? I hear now constantly of completed movies being shelved for reasons lesser than what was happening here. In today's dollars, $3 million would be about $19 million, and $9 million is about $58 million today. That is a huge jump. And movie budgets back in the 1970s were not nearly as large as they are now. The highest grossing movies in 1975, budgets range from $3 to $7 million, excluding Jaws, of course. So how in the world did they get to keep making this absolutely expensive movie? I think a couple things were happening here. One, by the time they started filming Jaws, the book had come out and it was selling spectacularly. Zanuck and Brown were right. The story of Jaws was a compelling one. Because it was selling so well, Universal wanted this movie made. The book was released in February of 1974. They began filming in May of that year, and by then it was already a hit. The hardcover stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for 44 weeks. Universal knew to some degree that they had a hit on their hands. They also understood that it would be difficult for other studios to duplicate a movie like this. They understood this honestly better than anybody because nothing like it had been attempted before, and they were now intimately familiar with the difficulties of filming something like this. Also, just Zanuck and Brown backing this movie was important too. They had formed a company called the Zanuck/Brown Company. It's now known as the Zanuck Company, but it's the same thing. They had produced the film The Sting, which had just won Best Picture and 6 other awards in April of 1974. Verna being on set was also a huge influence on the executives. She was very enthusiastic about the sequences she was working on, and the studio trusted her enough to believe her. As a venerated film editor, Mother Cutter, as she was known, had a good reputation at the time with the executives, so her word went a long way. By the time principal photography was over, she had edited the first act while waiting for all of the ocean sequences to be filmed. And, of course, once filming was over and the ocean was less of an element, things went pretty smoothly. They did a couple of test screenings, and they were both hits. These screenings gave the studio executives such confidence that they planned to do a wide release, which was totally not typical of films at the time. It was released in almost 500 theaters at the same time, which simply did not happen. And because of that, we have blockbusters today. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, though. I, of course, have more to say about this film, so I planned 2 more videos about what I love about the film itself, and also the effect that it had on the industry that ripples even 50 years later. It is honestly a miracle that this movie got made. And not just that it exists, but that it exists the way it does. So much of the crew from the Sugarland Express really worked together perfectly to create this film. From Verna, the editor, to John Williams, who created the iconic soundtrack, to Joe Alves, who worked on the shark and made it work, and found the perfect location in Martha's Vineyard. And of course, Steven Spielberg's intuition in order to make everything work. I can't imagine trying to juggle that crazy production while still trying to make sure your actors have an emotional through line and make it make sense. There's also a lot I didn't say here. If you want to learn more about the production of Jaws, I highly recommend reading The Jaws Log by Carl Gottlieb. I also use this a lot for my script too. And On Location on Martha's Vineyard, The Making of the Movie Jaws by Edith Blake. I also recommend the documentary The Shark is Still Working. That was super informative as well. And they have a lot more fun details that any Jaws fan would love, because I certainly had a great time learning all this stuff. I had so much fun making this video. Getting to research about one of my favorite movies was such a treat. And the fact that there's so much information that exists about the making of this movie is just such a treat to learn about and to dive into. It's been so much fun. So thank you so much for watching and giving me an excuse to read all these books about the making of Jaws.